Imagine you are a search and rescue officer trekking through a dead zone in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest, looking for a missing hiker who disappeared 48 hours ago. You're calling out his name, "Thomas, if you can hear me, shout back!" And suddenly, you hear his voice clear as a bell, responding from a thicket of ferns just 10 feet away, saying, "I'm right here, I'm hurt." You push through the brush to save him, but when you break into the clearing, you find a man standing there who looks exactly like Thomas. Same jacket, same hat, same face, except his eyes are nothing but hollow, black pits. And when he opens his mouth to speak, he doesn't use his lungs. He makes a mechanical clicking sound like a skipping record player before repeating your own name back to you in your own voice. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite professional SAR radio and submerge it in a bucket of thick black tar right before they head out on a critical midnight rescue mission. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, an area home to some of the most rugged, moss-covered terrain in North America. This is a place where the canopy is so thick that the forest floor is in a permanent state of twilight, and the fog can roll in so fast it swallows entire mountain ridges in seconds. Our main character is a man named Miller. Miller was a veteran search and rescue officer with over 15 years of experience. He was a man of cold logic, a man who had seen everything from grizzly attacks to hikers who had simply walked off cliffs in the dark. He didn't believe in the old legends or the whispers about things that haunt the high ridges. He believed in GPS coordinates, thermal imaging, and hard evidence. But in the spring of 2022, Miller encountered something that made him realize that the evidence can sometimes be the most terrifying thing of all. Miller was part of a 4-man team looking for a 24-year-old college student named David who had vanished while trail running. They were working in a sector known as the Blind Valley, a place where radio signals tend to drop and the silence feels heavier than usual. What we call an oppressive silence. It's the kind of quiet that feels like the world has ended and you're the only one left to witness the aftermath. Around 2 a.m., the team was moving through a dense stand of ancient cedars when they heard a voice. It was David's voice, coming from a ravine about 50 yards to their left. "Help down here, my leg is broken!" The team didn't hesitate. They scrambled down the slope, their headlamps slicing through the mist. Miller was the first to reach the bottom. He saw a figure sitting against a mossy log, wearing the exact neon yellow running vest David had been wearing when he went missing. Miller rushed over, shouting, "David, we've got you! Just stay still!" But as Miller got closer, his training took over, and he noticed something fundamentally wrong. The figure wasn't breathing. There was no misting of air in the freezing night, no rise and fall of the chest, and the figure was sitting perfectly still, not the stillness of an injured man, but the stillness of a statue. Miller stopped 10 feet away. "David?" The figure turned its head. It didn't turn like a human. It was a sharp, mechanical snap. As the beam of Miller's headlamp hit the face, Miller felt a wave of cold nausea wash over him. The face looked like a mask made of wet, gray parchment stretched too tight over a skull. The eyes were nothing but hollow, black pits of endless, starving hunger. And then, the creature opened its mouth. It didn't use its vocal cords. It made a wet, rhythmic clicking sound, and then it spoke in Miller's own voice, using the exact words Miller had said into his radio 10 minutes earlier. "Sector 4 is clear. Proceed to the ridge." Miller's team members burst into the clearing behind him, but Miller screamed at them to stop. "Back away! That's not him! That is not David!" The creature, this mimic or Wendigo, stood up. It didn't stand up like a person, it unfolded itself. It was easily 9 feet tall, its limbs snapping and clicking like breaking dry wood with every movement. Its skin was translucent, showing the skeletal ribs and pulsing red muscle beneath. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, covering the ground with an agility that defied every law of physics. As it moved, it began to cycle through the voices of everyone in the search party, screaming their names and their radio calls back at them in a chaotic, distorted choir. The SAR team didn't wait. They turned and ran. They didn't care about their gear or the missing hiker. They were in a race for their lives. They could hear the creature jumping through the canopy above them, snapping branches as thick as a man's leg. Every time one of the officers stumbled, the creature would let out a wet, guttural laugh that sounded like a serrated blade tearing through leather. They reached their vehicles at the trailhead, fumbling with the keys as the pale figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching them with a frozen, lipless grin. Miller officially resigned from the SAR team the next day. He told his superiors he was suffering from burnout, but the truth was he couldn't close his eyes without seeing those black pits of hunger. Search and rescue later returned to the Blind Valley with a larger force to find David. They found his neon yellow vest, but it wasn't on a body. It was neatly folded and placed in the center of a large, flat-topped granite boulder. Surrounding the vest was a perfect, intricate spiral made of thousands of human teeth, none of which belonged to David. When the authorities checked the GPS logs of Miller's team from that night, they found something that made them seal the file forever. The logs showed that while the team was running for their lives away from the ravine, a fifth signal identical to Miller's GPS signature had stayed behind in the valley. That signal stayed perfectly still for 3 hours before it slowly began to walk toward Miller's home address, moving at a constant, tireless pace of exactly 4 miles per hour. There is a theory on Reddit that the Wendigo, the mimic, doesn't just hunt for meat. It harvests the template of its prey. It studies your voice, your gait, and even your digital footprint until it can walk into your house and sit at your dinner table, and no one would ever know the difference. But the real bone-chilling question is this. Miller hasn't stepped foot in the woods since that night. But last night, his wife woke up to find Miller standing in the kitchen in the middle of the night, staring at the wall and making a faint, mechanical clicking sound. And when she asked him if he was okay, he turned to her and repeated her question back to her in David's voice. What just happened? Imagine waking up in your tent in the middle of a sub-zero night in the Canadian wilderness, and as you reach for your water bottle, you notice the fabric of your tent is vibrating. Not from the wind, but from the sound of thousands of rhythmic, wet thuds hitting the frozen ground just outside. You unzip the flap just an inch to peek out, and your flashlight beam reveals a sea of fresh, barefoot human footprints in the snow, thousands of them, all identical in size, circling your tent in a perfect, tightening spiral. You realize with a jolt of pure adrenaline that you haven't heard a single footstep, and as you look further into the dark, you see a pair of pale, skeletal legs that don't seem to end, standing perfectly still right behind your head. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So, if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite pair of thermal hiking socks and fill them with ice-cold maple syrup right before they head out for a solo winter camping trip. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the jagged, frostbitten heart of the Yukon Territory. This is a land that is beautiful, but it is deeply, profoundly indifferent to human life. It's a place where the winter sun only shows its face for a few hours a day, leaving the rest of the world in a bruised, purple twilight. Our main character is a man named Julian. Julian was a high-level winter survivalist and a hobbyist photographer. He was the kind of guy who didn't just go camping, he went looking for the kind of isolation that would make most people lose their minds. He was a man of cold logic and heavy gear, and he prided himself on his leave no trace philosophy. But in December of 2023, Julian realized that something in the Yukon was leaving traces for him, traces that defied every law of biology. Julian had traveled nearly 80 miles past the last logging road to reach a plateau he called the Glass Barrens. He wanted to capture the aurora borealis over a frozen lake. The first 2 days were quiet, but on the third night, the atmosphere shifted. The wind, which had been a constant, howling presence, suddenly died down to what we call an oppressive silence. Every bird, every rustling branch, and even the sound of the freezing lake ice cracking simply ceased to exist. It was a heavy, suffocating, quiet, the kind that makes you feel like the world has stopped breathing just to watch you. Julian was sitting inside his four-season tent, melting snow for tea, when he heard a sound that made his blood turn to ice. It was a wet, rhythmic clicking. It sounded like someone tapping two stones together, but it was coming from the air above his tent. He sat perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He grabbed his high-intensity flashlight and shined it through the mesh window. At first, he saw nothing but the white expanse of snow. But then, he lowered the beam. Surrounding his tent were footprints. Thousands of them. They were human, barefoot, and looked as though they had been pressed into the snow with incredible force. There was no trail leading to the tent, the footprints, just time-started times there, forming a perfect, intricate spiral that looped around his campsite hundreds of times. Julian's mind raced. It was negative 30 degrees out. No human could walk barefoot in this snow for 5 seconds without losing their toes, let alone create a massive geometric pattern. Suddenly, a voice whispered from the dark, right next to the tent wall. It was Julian's own voice, but it sounded distorted, like a recording being played through a layer of water. "Julian, look at the patterns. Don't they look beautiful?" Julian froze. He hadn't said that. He hadn't spoken a word in 3 days. He watched as a shadow began to pass over the tent, a figure taller than any person had a right to be, easily 10 feet tall, and so thin it looked like a skeletal branch against the moon. The creature moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs snapping and clicking like breaking ice with every step. Its skin was translucent, stretched so tight over its ribs that it looked like wet parchment, and its eyes were nothing but hollow pits of endless, starving hunger. The horror wasn't just in the sight, it was in the physics. As the creature walked, it left no new tracks. It was as if the tracks were appearing spontaneously around it, or perhaps as if the creature was walking on a layer of reality just a fraction of an inch above the snow. Julian realized then that this thing, this Wendigo, wasn't just hunting him for meat. It was recording his presence, marking his location in the world as if preparing to harvest him. Every time Julian moved his hand toward his bear spray, the creature would mimic the sound of the fabric rubbing together, echoing it back to him with a wet, guttural laugh that sounded like a serrated blade tearing through leather. Julian didn't wait for the sun. He burst out of the tent, clutching his keys and his camera, and ran for his snowmobile. He could hear the creature jumping through the stunted trees behind him, moving with an agility that defied every law of physics. He drove like a madman through the darkness, the wind screaming in his ears, feeling like the trees were shifting their positions to block his path. He didn't look back until he reached a highway outpost 5 hours later. Search and rescue teams later went back to the Glass Barrens. They found Julian's tent, but it wasn't shredded. It was standing perfectly intact. However, the interior was covered in a thick, translucent slime that smelled like copper and old earth. What they found outside was worse. The thousands of barefoot footprints were still there, but they had changed. They were no longer Julian's foot size. They had grown. They were now the size of the lead investigators' feet, and they led directly away from the camp toward the town where Julian was currently staying. There is a theory on Reddit that the Wendigo, the thing that leaves the spiral of prints, doesn't just kill you, it steals your walk. It harvests the path you've taken in life and uses it to find your home. But the real, bone-chilling question is this. Julian moved to a city in the south and never stepped foot in the snow again. But last night, he woke up to a sound in his hallway. He looked out and saw a trail of wet, barefoot human footprints leading from his front door directly to his bedside, and as he looked at the floor, he heard his own voice whisper from under the bed, "I finally caught up, Julian." Imagine you were sitting in a remote hunting cabin, miles away from the nearest cell tower, waiting for your best friend to return from his solo trek into the frozen brush. You hear his familiar heavy boots on the porch. You hear him whistle that same off-key tune he always does, and when he walks through the door, he looks exactly like the man you've known for 20 years. But then, he sits down across from you, stares into the fire with unblinking eyes, and asks you a question about a memory that never happened using a voice that sounds like it's being played through a broken speaker. You look down at his shadow on the wall, and instead of a man, you see something with antlers and limbs that are 5 feet too long, and you realize with a jolt of pure electricity that whatever just walked into your cabin is wearing your friend's skin like a cheap, ill-fitting suit. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So, if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite camouflage hunting jacket and sew the sleeves shut right before they head out for a weekend trek into the deepest, coldest part of the Alaskan wilderness. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the frozen, unforgiving landscape of the Yukon Territory, a place where the trees are so thick they seem to hold their breath, and the silence is so heavy it can actually make your ears ring with a deafening pressure. Our main character is a man named Elias. Elias was a seasoned hunter, a man who grew up with a rifle in his hand and a deep, ingrained respect for the old rules of the North rules, like never leaving a fire unattended and never answering a voice in the woods that calls your name. He wasn't alone. He was with his longtime hunting partner, a boisterous, larger-than-life guy named Miller. They had shared dozens of camps together, survived bone-chilling blizzards, and tracked elk through terrain that would break a normal man's spirit. But in November of 2017, the Yukon decided to test them in a way that had nothing to do with the weather or the wolves. They had set up their base camp in a valley known by the locals as the Hollow, a place where the shadows always seemed a bit too dark even at noon, and the game tended to vanish without a trace. On the third day, Miller decided to head out alone to scout a ridge about 3 miles to the north. He promised to be back by sundown. But as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the snow in a sickly, bruised purple, Miller hadn't returned. Elias sat by the wood stove in their small cabin, watching the clock. 6 p.m. passed. Then 8 p.m., the forest outside fell into what we call an oppressive silence, the kind of quiet that feels like the world has ended and you're the only one left to witness the aftermath. Suddenly, Elias heard a sound that broke the tension. It was the distinct crunch of snow, followed by a familiar, heavy footfall on the wooden stairs of the porch. The door creaked open, and Miller stepped in. He was covered in frost, his face red from the biting cold, and he looked absolutely exhausted. "Rough day, Elias," he said, tossing his gear into the corner with a dull thud. But something was off. Miller didn't head for the coffee pot like he always did. Instead, he sat in the corner shadow where the light of the kerosene lamp couldn't quite reach him. He sat with his back perfectly straight, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames of the stove, not blinking once. "Find anything out there?" Elias asked, his hand instinctively tightening around his tin mug. He noticed that Miller's breathing was silent, no huffing from the cold, no labored gasps from the long hike. "Found a spiral," Miller replied. His voice was identical to Miller's, but the pacing was fundamentally wrong. There was a microscopic, jarring delay between each word, as if he were learning how to construct sentences in real time by mimicking a recording. "A spiral of bones, Elias. Just like the ones we saw in Montana back in '94. Remember? The marrow was so sweet." Elias felt a wave of cold nausea wash over him. His blood felt like slush in his veins. He and Miller had never hunted in Montana in 1994. They had met in 2002 Inches, a rainy shipyard in Seattle. They had never seen a spiral of bones together. "Right," Elias whispered, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Montana. I almost forgot. That was a hell of a trip." He watched Miller, or the thing that looked like Miller, carefully. The man's skin seemed to be vibrating, almost rippling, as if something underneath the surface was shifting and trying to adjust its fit. When Miller reached out to warm his hands by the fire, Elias noticed his fingers. They were too long, just by an inch or two, but enough to make them look like the legs of a giant spider. And then there was the smell. It wasn't the smell of sweat, wood smoke, and pine. It was a cloying metallic stench, the smell of wet copper and old stagnant earth that had never seen the sun. "You okay, Miller? You look different," Elias said. Testing the waters, his hand slowly moving toward the shotgun leaning against the wall. The thing in the chair turned its head. It didn't turn like a human. It was a sharp, mechanical snap. "I'm just hungry, Elias. The hunger. It's like a fire that won't go out. Don't you feel it too?" As it spoke, its jaw seemed to unhinge slightly further than a human jaw should go, and for a split second, Elias saw a second row of jagged, yellowed teeth behind the ones he recognized as Miller's. "I think I left the extra kerosene in the shed," Elias said, standing up slowly, his legs feeling like lead. He didn't look back. He walked out the door into the biting, sub-zero cold, and instead of going to the shed, he sprinted for the ATV. As he threw his leg over the seat and turned the key, the engine roared to life, echoing off the silent trees. He looked back at the cabin window one last time. Miller was standing there, his face pressed so hard against the glass that his skin was turning white, but his face was melting. The skin was sagging off the bone, the blue eyes were now nothing but hollow, black pits of endless, starving hunger, and a pair of dark, velvet-covered antlers were beginning to push through his forehead. The creature opened its mouth, and in Miller's boisterous, laughing voice, it screamed through the glass, "Where are you going, Elias? We haven't even finished the memories yet." "The marrow is almost ready." Elias pinned the throttle. He drove through the night, his vision blurring from the wind and the sheer, unadulterated terror. He felt like the trees were shifting their positions around him, trying to warp the trail to lead him back to the cabin. In his peripheral vision, he saw pale, spindly shapes jumping from branch to branch with a jerky, unnatural gait that no human could ever achieve. He didn't stop until he reached a highway outpost 50 miles away, stumbling into the fluorescent light of a gas station, sobbing and screaming for someone to call the police. The authorities went back to the cabin 2 days later. What they found defied explanation. The cabin was completely empty. Miller's gear, his rifle, even the food in the pantry had vanished into thin air. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no tracks in the snow leading away from the porch. But they did find one thing in the wood stove. It wasn't wood ash. It was a pile of Miller's teeth, all 32 of them, perfectly intact and arranged in a small, intricate spiral on the metal floor. There is a theory among the deep woods researchers on Reddit that the Wendigo, or a variation known as the Fleshgate, doesn't just kill its prey. It consumes the very essence of them, harvesting their memories to use as bait for the next person in the circle. It wears the life of the person it took like a mask until the mask rots away. But the real question, the one that keeps Elias awake at night, is this. Elias moved 3 states away, changed his phone number, and never told a soul where he went. But last night, at 3 a.m., his phone buzzed. He picked it up, and on the other end, he heard his own voice, not his old voice, but his current shaky voice saying, "Elias, you forgot your shotgun at the cabin. I'm standing right outside your front door to bring it back." Imagine you are standing in the middle of a forest so dense that the canopy above chokes out the sun, leaving the world below in a permanent, sickly twilight. You've been hiking for hours, following a trail that was clearly marked on your map, but suddenly, the path simply vanishes beneath a carpet of dead, black leaves that seem to swallow the sound of your footsteps. The birds have stopped singing. The wind has died down to a deathly, unnatural calm. And in the center of a perfectly circular clearing, where the trees look twisted as if they grew in constant agony, you find it. A massive, intricate spiral made of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of small animal bones, ribs, vertebrae, and skulls, all bleached to a haunting porcelain white and polished as if by human hands. You tell yourself it's just a strange art project, a prank by some local teenager with too much time on his hands. But then you notice a single black crow's feather standing perfectly upright in the exact center of the spiral, and you see a drop of dark red marrow still leaking from a fresh break in a deer's femur. That's when you hear it. your own voice whispering from the shadows directly behind your ear saying, "Don't go yet, I'm not finished with you." If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite pair of waterproof hiking boots and fill them with fast-drying industrial cement right before they head out on a 20-mile trek into the deepest, most forbidden part of the wilderness. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the sprawling, ancient forests of Massachusetts, an area known for a complicated history of strange disappearances, ancient stone structures, and unsettling events that defy every known law of logic and science. Our main character is a man named Leo. Now, Leo wasn't a novice. He was a seasoned hiker, a man who found more peace in the whisper of wind through pine needles than in the noise of any city street. He was the kind of person who kept a meticulous log of his travels, knew how to read the clouds like a book, and could track a deer across dry rock. He certainly didn't believe in the campfire tales about monsters lurking in what the locals call the Forbidden Triangle. To Leo, the woods were a sanctuary, not a graveyard. But on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, the forest decided to show Leo that some legends aren't just stories, they are warnings written in blood. Leo had hiked nearly 15 miles into the backcountry, moving deeper into a sector that most hikers avoid because the compasses tend to spin erratically there. He planned to spend 2 nights completely off the grid, seeking the kind of silence that only the deep woods can provide. The first day was idyllic. The air was crisp, the leaves were a riot of orange and gold, and he felt a profound sense of solitude. He set up his camp near a small, nameless creek and watched the stars emerge. But as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, the entire atmosphere shifted. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted, and the forest fell into what we call an oppressive silence. Every cricket, every rustle of wind, every natural sound simply ceased to exist. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind that makes you feel like the trees are leaning in, holding their breath just to hear your heartbeat. That night, Leo was woken up at exactly 3:33 a.m. by a single, sharp twig snap right outside his tent. It was a sound so deliberate, it felt like a knock on a door. He sat perfectly still, his hand gripping his hunting knife, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He expected to hear the heavy breathing of a bear or the scuffle of a coyote, but all he heard in return was a low, rhythmic humming. It wasn't a human voice, and it wasn't a machine. It was a guttural, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the very ground, through his sleeping pad, and directly into the bones of his legs. It felt less like a sound and more like a physical weight pressing down on the tent. He stayed awake until the first gray light of dawn, staring at the thin nylon walls, terrified that if he blinked, whatever was outside would find its way in. The next morning, Leo tried to shake off his fear. He told himself it was just infrasound or a vivid dream brought on by the thin mountain air. But as he packed his gear and continued toward his next waypoint, he realized the forest was no longer familiar. The trees looked different, grayer, taller, with branches that looked like reaching fingers. And then he found the grove. It was a stand of pines that looked as if they had been scorched, though there was no sign of fire. In the center sat a large, flat-topped granite boulder, and on top of it was that perfect, intricate spiral of animal bones. As Leo stepped closer, he realized the bones were arranged by size and type, creating a hypnotic pattern that seemed to pulse in his vision. A wave of cold nausea washed over him as he saw a small pendant, a silver locket, resting near the edge of the spiral. He recognized it. It belonged to a hiker who had gone missing in these woods 3 years ago. He realized then that the humming he heard at night wasn't a sound of nature, it was the sound of something building this altar. He felt watched by unseen eyes from the dark, lightless spaces between the trees. Every instinct he had as a survivalist told him one thing: run. He didn't pack his gear with his usual care. He shoved everything into his bag with frantic, shaking hands and practically sprinted back the way he came. But the forest began to warp around him. The landmarks he had passed only hours before a fallen log, a specific rock formation, were gone, replaced by thickets of thorns that seemed to grow across the path as he watched. Every time he paused to catch his breath, he saw it in his peripheral vision, a pale, spindly shape moving with a jerky, unnatural gait far too fast for any living creature. It was easily 9 feet tall, its gray skin stretched so tight over its skeletal frame that it looked like wet parchment, and its eyes, they weren't eyes at all, but hollow, black pits of endless, starving hunger. The horror wasn't just in the creature's appearance. It was in the way it used sound as a weapon. The thing began to mimic Leo's own heavy, shuddering breaths, echoing them back to him from the trees. When Leo stumbled over a root, the creature let out a wet, guttural laugh that sounded like a serrated blade tearing through thick leather. It began to call his name, not in its own voice, but in the voice of his younger brother, then in the voice of a crying child. And finally, it used Leo's own voice to scream for help, using the exact same words Leo had whispered to himself just minutes before. Leo didn't stop. He pushed himself past the point of exhaustion, his lungs feeling like they were filled with broken glass and fire. He finally burst through the final stretch of trees, stumbling onto the gravel of the parking lot. Dia scrambled into his car, fumbling with the keys, his eyes darting to the tree line where he saw the pale figure standing perfectly still, watching him. He locked the doors and drove like a madman, not stopping until he reached a crowded diner 3 towns away, where the bright fluorescent lights and the smell of grease finally made the world feel real again. But the story doesn't end there. Search and rescue teams, acting on Leo's frantic report, went back to that grove 2 days later. They found the granite boulder, but the bone spiral had vanished as if it had never existed. There were no tracks, no blood, and no sign of a struggle. In the center of the boulder, however, they found a single handheld camera, Leo's camera, the one he swore was buried deep in his backpack when he reached his car. When the authorities played the footage, there was no video of Leo's hike. There was only 30 minutes of a wet, clicking sound coming from inside a dark underground space, followed by a voice that sounded exactly like the lead investigator, speaking in a low, intimate whisper. "I can taste your fear, Leo. The spiral is almost complete, and I'm coming home." There is a theory among the deep dive communities on Reddit that the Wendigo doesn't just hunt for meat. It marks its prey. Once you lay eyes on the bone spiral, you've been invited to a ritual where you are the only guest and the only item on the menu. But the real bone-chilling question is this. If Leo truly made it out of those woods that morning, why did his brother call the police last night, crying, claiming he heard Leo's voice whispering through the air vents of their house, saying that the marrow in his bones was finally ripe for the harvest?